Alright guys, so today we're going to start talking about object-oriented programming in JavaScript. Now, object-oriented programming can mean a variety of things. Not all aspects of object-oriented programming are supported in JavaScript. For example, if you're a kind of accomplished or experienced C++ or C# or Java developer, there's going to be things like polymorphism and stuff like that are missing from JavaScript right out of the bag. But for the most part, what we're going to be talking about is the different ways of creating objects in JavaScript, what you can do with them, how to create constructors, and kind of simulate the whole classes and objects things in JavaScript. So, it's basically how to program in JavaScript without worrying too much about what's on the screen. As you can see here in my index.html, I'm not going to do anything this week in CSS, and this is all I'm going to do in the HTML layer. So we're just going to reference the script file. I'm going to close that and forget about it. And everything else, I'm kind of just going to forget about it and open this up. And we're only going to work in the JavaScript file this week. So I'm going to close that and maximize that, and we're just going to work in this one JavaScript file and see what we can do. So to start things off, if hopefully you read through all of the W3 Schools tutorials for how to do JavaScript programming, and you'll probably have seen something like this. You can create any type of variable like x, and you can say it's a new object. And since JavaScript is a dynamic language, and we've talked about this before, you can take any old object and throw properties on there kind of on the fly. So I can say x.name equals something, and I can say x.id equals 123, and I can just save that. And what we're going to do, instead of having to put alerts all over the place, we're going to kind of debug these objects in Chrome so that we can see what's going on. So over here, if I go to Inspect Element in Chrome, and I click on the Sources tab, and I make sure that I have my JavaScript file highlighted here. So if I put a breakpoint here on the first line, and I refresh the page, so it's going to stop there. And right now, since I don't have anything scoped, I just put my lines of code right there without doing anything to them. I'm going to look in global. So if I skip over this line of code, so if I run var x equals new object, hopefully down here, way at the bottom of these global variables, I'll have one called x, the variable that I just declared. So you'll see right here, I now have x as a global variable, and it really has nothing in it except this proto thing, which we're going to talk about later. So the second instruction is going to attach a new property to x, and it's going to, by virtue of the value on the right being a string, it's going to create basically a string object on the name property of x. So if I go over that, oops, it closed it up. Let me open that up again, all the way down at the bottom. So now we see that the x object has a name property that has the value of something, and then one more step over, and we should get the ID too. And then the ID is 123. So you can see that the ID has an integer value and the name has a string value. So I guess I'll just take this opportunity here to point out that everything in JavaScript is an object. This value of name is actually a string object, and this value of ID is actually an integer object. And I think you can see in W3 School is pretty good. If you go to JavaScript, and you go to object definitions, so it shows you right here of the explicit way that you can create everything, like we just did. New object, you can do new string, new number, new boolean, new array, but you never really have to do this. People don't really do this anymore, at least I don't, because just by virtue of the type being obvious in the value that you're assigning, it will automatically instantiate an object of that type. So this will instantiate a string, this will instantiate a number, this will instantiate a boolean. So to exemplify that, we'll start off with getting rid of that new object and replacing it with that, which basically means new object. So back here, I can just do that, and it'll be the same thing. So long story short is you don't really need to use the new operator if you're working with primitives or just generic objects. So one thing that was kind of annoying was that it wasn't scoped really under anything. These variables were just sitting there in global space. And I already told you guys in the past videos it's not really very good. You kind of want to scope everything so that everything has a home and you don't have naming conflicts. You need to have nice namespaces. So I'm kind of going to create an object here just to create a namespace. I'll just call it main, I guess. I'm only going to use that as a namespace. So instead of var x equals new object, I can say main dot x equals new object. So now x is still a variable, but it lives on the main object instead of being a global variable. So it's kind of better. It's not just floating out in the middle of global space. So now it'll be easier to debug, because if I put a breakpoint here, let me put it up here. And so now if I can go up here to watch, and I put a watch on main. So as I kind of step over these now, create the object, create the name, create the ID, I can kind of see my X object right here instead of having to go through all these global variables. It's right here, nice and tidy, scoped in my main namespace. So yeah, I created an object called name, but it's really just serving to kind of contain this little scope, this little namespace, to organize my things pretty much. So that's kind of the very basics of defining an object. Now there's a few different ways to define an object in JavaScript. Let me actually get rid of this whole X thing. I'm going to do something like this. Say Donnie. I'll call it Donnie instead of name. Here's my name, and I'll call this one age, just to give this meaning instead of any old value. So this is the first way to create an object right here. You basically just create it like this and then start throwing properties on it. Oh yeah, one other thing. There's two different ways to refer to a property. One is with the dot, like you're seeing here. So dot means you go within the Donnie object. I'm going to access a property called name. There is another way to do that. You can say you can use the index operator and put the property name in there. So I could say color and hair color. So this is pretty much the same thing. If you're used to like things like hash tables in programming, you can see that these objects really are just collections or dictionaries or hash tables, and these dot age is really just kind of hashing into the table or the dictionary to find that particular property. So we can see that. Let's just look at it one more time in the debugger just to make doubly sure. So I go to sources, go to my script, put a breakpoint here, and go. And without even, one way obviously is you can look in the watch over here. Donnie, you can see all the properties, but also you can just come over here and hover over Donnie, and you can see the age, eye color, hair color, and the name. So that's pretty nice. I can hover over main and see everything in the namespace, and it just shows there's one object currently in the main namespace, which is Donnie. So this is pretty clean, hopefully pretty easy to understand. This is basic programming stuff. This is basic object-oriented programming stuff. So if you're totally lost, you probably need to study object-oriented programming before you get this far. All right, so the second way to create a object in JavaScript is kind of using, what do they call it? They call it like a literal object, or sometimes people call this JSON notation. We're going to be getting to JSON, next week or maybe the week after that. But so the way you do that is, I'll use my brother in this example, M-I-C-H-A-E-L. Actually, not var. I'll say main.M-I-C-H-A-E-L. So instead of doing something like this, I can inline define all the properties, so I don't have to, have 4 lines of code to say what's my name, what's my age, what's my this, what's my that. So inside of the curly braces, I can just put a comma delimited list of name value pairs. So I could say name is MICHEL, comma, age is 28, and I think I can leave it at that. So let's see if that works. So breakpoint here at the end, refresh it, and here I have now an object named Michael within the scope of main with an age of 28 and the name of Michael. So this is the second way you can do it. And notice, again, this is the nature of dynamic objects in JavaScript. This variable has its own properties because I put them on one at a time. This, 4 properties in a row, no rules, because it's a dynamic object. I can put properties on as I will. The fact that I chose name and age that are also on this object, I could put any properties I want on here. So that's that. So this is kind of what they call a literal, or a literal object instantiation, or inline object instantiation, or this is kind of this whole thing right here is kind of JavaScript object notation, JSON. Anytime you see a comma delimited list of name value pairs where the name and the value are separated by a colon, that's kind of like JSON notation. So the last way is now getting into more object-oriented programming. So this kind of thing we've seen before already, but now, talking about object-oriented programming a little bit, we can create what we call a constructor. And, for anybody that's done OO before, the constructor is like the piece of the class that defines how you create objects. And it's like the singular blueprint for all of the instance objects that you're going to create. So, let's say I do something like, I want to be able to create a person, right? And every person I create is going to have the same variables inside. So I could say person is a function, and it's a function of first name, last name, and age. Say something like that. So what this means, this is creating an object, just like main.michael equals is creating an object. Main.person equals is also creating an object, but the object that it's creating is a function. And the function has access to itself, the object that's invoking it, so this. And in the same way, I can start throwing properties on the object. So I can say, every person is going to have a first name. Every person is going to have a last name. And every person is going to have an age. So by doing this, first name, passing these 3 parameters and taking them, and this is on the fly creating 3 properties inside of this object. We're going to be able to reuse this function to create homogeneously constituted objects. So that if I come down here and I say main.Alana equals new person, then I can pass in 3 parameters, 1, 2, and 3. And that should invoke this function up here and automatically attach these 3 properties with the values that I passed through the parameter list. And this is totally reusable, so I can call this as many times as I want. So I could say Marcia, Don, it's my family. Let's see, how old is my mom now? 66. Alright, so as you can see, by creating the constructor here, I've allowed myself to invoke the person function anytime I want, and it's going to create an object with the 3 properties that I specified with the 3 values that I'm passing in through the parameter list. Okay? So now, if I come back here and debug this again, So I'm going to put a breakpoint way down here at the end. And I'll pass that up so I have everything. So inside of main, now I can see all my objects. I have Donnie, it's the same as before. I have Michael, same as before. And now these 3 lines of code, new, are should have created 3 objects that look exactly the same other than their values. So if I look at Alana, she's got an age, a first name, and a last name. If I look at Marcia, also age, first name, and a last name. And Don, also age, first name, and a last name. So you can see we've got some, the beginnings of object-oriented programming going on here, where I have my constructor, and I'm able to say, I've already defined the behavior of the creation of a person. I've written some, and this is the key, I've written some reusable code so that every time I invoke this snippet of code here to say, hey, I'm creating a person, I won't have to say what they're constituted of. They're going to have a first name and a last name and an age just by virtue of invoking the constructor, and that's kind of the point. So this is the beginnings of object-oriented programming in JavaScript. I guess the last thing that I want to say here before I move on to kind of end this video and move on to the second one is, be aware that you still have the ability to have 2 variables that reference the same object. So let's just demonstrate that really quick before we move on. So I'm going to say main.youngest in family equals main.michael. Main.oldest in family equals main.don. So come back here, refresh, debug that again. So this is important. So youngest in family, I notice it says Michael and it says 28. And if I come up here and I look at the Michael object, that's also Michael and 28. So the important thing to understand is, just like in object-oriented programming, when I take an object reference, like main.oldest in family, and I point it, when the value on the right is an object that already exists, it's not going to create a copy of that object. It's not going to instantiate an object. This is very important to understand. It's simply going to point this variable, oldest in family, and refer to the memory address of the object on the right. So, this is kind of the first day that I teach object-oriented programming. We kind of learn the difference between, a variable like this pointing at an object you just created, or a variable like this pointing at an object that already exists. As long as you understand there's no creation going on here, and it's very easy to see because you can't create an object without using the word new, right? New is the only way to create an object, basically, unless we're doing this. But anytime you see the assignment operator and the thing on the right is clearly an object that already exists somewhere else, there's no object creation going on there. So that's just pretty important to note. So this is the beginnings of object-oriented programming in JavaScript. I know we've covered some of this before, but like I said, like I've said a few times, I think JavaScript is kind of the core of the front end, and probably the hardest to learn for most people that take this class. So I don't think it hurts to review it too much, especially since pretty soon we're going to be getting into the project for the class, the bigger project, in addition to the labs that we're doing every week. So I'm going to do one more video talking about some of the other finer details of OO in JavaScript, and then we'll wrap it up and I'll give you guys an assignment. So we're not going to have too long of a lecture here, because I think I really want you guys to just master the fundamentals. I don't want to inundate you with information. I just want you to have a really good understanding of what's important. Alright, so we'll move on to the next part.